talk I've been wanting to give, and it is a talk about auditory processing disorders and the overwhelmingness of the world. So, what I'd like to talk with you about is a patient of mine who I will name Sarah. And Sarah had a very hard time growing up. She was very bright, very creative, struggling in school, but labeled inattentive, lazy by the teachers. There were some mixed signals that are hard to catch. So it's not that confusing that the parents and the teachers overlook that. And that was that Sarah had both some auditory processing disorder issues, and she also had a fluctuating progressive hearing loss that would go up and down from normal to mild to moderate in a day or two, and nobody would know why. There was a lot of initial misdiagnosis and self-doubt for Sarah. So she was initially identified with ADHD and took medication for ADHD because that's what you typically do, but it worsened her anxiety and her other sensory issues. As things went on, there was a very long road to understanding. She had years and years of being misdiagnosed. She was accused of faking before they finally came up with the accurate diagnosis of auditory processing disorder, autism spectrum disorder, and progressive hearing loss. The combination is just very confusing to tease apart because they can all kind of look like each other. Auditory processing disorder looks a lot like hearing loss, and some of the autism type things like delayed language and missing social cues, those can also show up similarly, both for hearing loss and for auditory processing disorder. So Sarah really struggled quite a lot with the teachers and the doctors unintentionally, but even so, gaslighting her and convincing her that what her experiences had been were actually not real at all. And that led her to a level of feeling very invalidated. She felt that people didn't believe her, and it really made her question her own feelings about reality, like what she was experiencing herself. Were they real experiences? This sets the stage for us to talk about how these types of stories exemplify the challenges that are faced by neurodivergent individuals, such as Sarah, and particularly when it comes to the sensory overwhelm associated with auditory processing disorder and related conditions like ADHD and autism. So I think it's important to understand that auditory processing disorder can do a couple of different things to sounds. It can make sounds harder to hear, and that's because you might miss little chunks of information in the sound, like is that a voiced or a voiceless consonant? Was it a sh or was it a zh? Was it a ba or was it a pa? If you can't hear those things, that can make things that you can't hear them well. Another thing is it can cause sounds to feel louder than they actually are, especially moderate and loud sounds. And the third thing it can do is it can cause you to have distortion in the sound. You can actually find that it's very hard to filter out the speech signal from the background noise, and you can also be in pain. Many people who have auditory processing disorders also have issues with hyperacusis and misophonia. These are two different issues that both can cause a lot of trouble. The best way to put it is hyperacusis is when you can't tolerate sounds that are kind of moderate to loud because they are physically uncomfortable. For example, if you had a sunburn and your skin is just burning, you're all red, and someone walks up to you and slaps you, it could be a normal level of a touch, like getting hit on the shoulder, hey, so good to see you. But because it's on that sensitized area, it's much more painful. And that's it's a similar comparison to what hyperacusis would be like. It's a sensitized area, so even moderate to loud sounds can cause pain, sometimes even softer than that. Misophonia is much more about people-made sounds, typically, or repetitive sounds that should be controlled by people. It has more to do with mirror neurons and the body's ability to believe that a signal is coming from someone else is actually in the body, or reflects and resonates in the body in some way that it can cause a feeling that boundaries are being walked over. So it brings up this protective, disgusted, angry response. So hyperacusis is more like fear, anxiety, feeling like you can't control the environment. Misophonia tends to be more on that disgust, anger realm of get off my space. In any case, both of those happen relatively commonly within children and adults who have auditory processing disorders, particularly those who are also autistic or ADHD. Another very common crossover is dyslexia. Dyslexia can also make people much less able to parse apart sounds and speech, and that's why a lot of times they have phonological problems that cause them issues with reading as one of the multiple things that can go on. So looking back at Sarah, who has basically 3 issues going on: autism, ADHD, and it was 4. Autism, ADHD, auditory processing disorder, and the progressive hearing loss. Those are all woven in a way that they affect each other, and it's not at all of a unique kind of a thing. Many people who have auditory processing issues and related conditions tend to get misdiagnosed because the medical model's focus, it's on labels, not on functional health. So let's talk for a second about the medical model. Here's the general limitations you can expect. One is called reductionism, which is that it reduces a complex individual to just a list of symptoms and diagnoses, not looking at the whole picture of the person. There's how do you pronounce that? Pathologization. And that's basically putting up problems as something you need to be fixed. So if a person has an arm that isn't working as well, it clearly needs to be fixed. We can't just try to understand and accept it, even if the patient is okay with it. We also tend to, in the medical model, look at individual blame. So we'll blame the individual for whatever's going on with them. You broke your arm, it was your fault. Never mind the fact that the street was slippery with oil, ignoring the environmental factors and the systemic barriers. In all reality, we need to have a paradigm shift. We have to advocate for a much more holistic approach at looking at auditory processing disorders and related symptoms and disorders. And we need to look at the connectedness and the differences between these various experiences that people are having. We need to start challenging the medical model's negative views, and we need to start promoting inclusivity. So when you looked at Sarah's model with the auditory processing and the autism and the hearing loss combined, did I add in ADHD out of a glitch in my memory? Well, maybe. It's very hard to separate out when you have the same kinds of symptoms going on. When you have autism and the shirt tag, for me it was always sock seams, and foods that didn't feel right in my mouth. If you are ADHD out of a glitch in my memory, well, maybe. It's very hard to separate out when you have the same kinds of symptoms going on. When you have autism and the shirt tag, For me, it was always sock seams, and foods that didn't feel right in my mouth. If you already are being traumatized by something like your sock seams, it's possible you'll be less aware of where sounds are coming from in space, and therefore you might trip on something and fall. Is that because of the autism? Is that because of the APD and the lack of noticing of the spatial cues? Could it be the hearing loss? You just aren't aware of them at all. That you tripped on something by the edge of a stream and went down. But in any case, it's very, very difficult to separate out these issues from each other. They are just too interconnected to be considered separate problems. So auditory processing disorder rarely exists alone. It often co-occurs with ADHD, with autism, with dyslexia, anxiety disorders, and also with sensory processing disorder, which in my opinion is kind of like the big great granddaddy of autism, and APD. Fluctuating hearing loss can also add complexity and make it very difficult to figure out what is auditory processing, what is auditory deprivation that's being caused by the fluctuating loss. Why is this person not picking up language? Very hard to know. Or if they're an adult, why are they doing so much better one day than another? So there are a lot of also shared threads between these disorders. For example, difficulty processing sensory information or challenges with attention and focus. There are very often social communication difficulties because people miss social cues or they never learn them at all. And even emotional regulation challenges, because if you're already tired and you're already confused and things aren't predictable and things are overwhelming, it makes a lot of sense you don't have a lot of cognitive energy left to keep perfect control over emotions. A main point that's very important to understand is that auditory processing disorder does not stand alone. It can worsen other conditions, and they can worsen the auditory processing. Hearing loss makes everything even more unpredictable. Because it's very interesting. I've seen people with different amounts of hearing loss. They could be identical hearing, but totally different amounts of function. I knew somebody with a 70 decibel hearing loss who worked on the phone all day explaining blood lab reports. That's not typical auditory processing for a severe hearing loss. And you could have another person with the exact same hearing loss functioning basically as if they have almost no hearing at all. Maybe they only recognize dog barks. You never know. The numbers, they lie. So in Sarah's experience in particular, the auditory processing plus the ADHD and the fluctuating hearing loss caused her to be more distracted and harder to keep up in class. The auditory processing disorder plus the autism plus the hearing loss gave her a sense of very overwhelming senses, which led to some social anxiety and fear that she was also falling behind and being noticed in a bad way. Finally, the auditory processing issues and the anxiety along with the hearing loss added even more to the social anxiety and the fear of misunderstanding others. This was a very traumatic experience for this kid. And hopefully at some point she will be able to forgive not being identified earlier and not being given help earlier and being told that what she was experiencing wasn't true. Which is why I'd like to talk about the danger of gaslighting and invalidation. So there is a term called imposter syndrome, which is where you don't really believe that you are qualified to be performing a role that you're in. So let's say I became a brand new audiologist. I went to work for a ENT office, and they rushed me through all of the training in a day or two, and I barely knew what I was doing, I would be going around for most of the first few weeks thinking to myself, do they know that I don't belong here? Because I don't feel like I belong here. I feel like I don't know what I'm doing. That's imposter syndrome. It's this feeling of self-doubt. And in her case, she was having it made much worse by the accusations of faking her hearing loss. And she was thinking things like, maybe they're right, maybe I'm making this up. Am I really struggling, or am I just being dramatic? And they might be asking her questions like, your hearing seems just fine to me, and you were able to hear me with no problems yesterday. On top of that, there's a third term that I think is important to mention. It's rejection sensitivity dysphoria. This is a very strong emotional reaction to feeling rejected, or that you might be rejected because of not being believed. In her case, that would be a very central topic. Not everybody with rejection sensitivity dysphoria worries about not being believed. They just are terrified of being rejected, like as a friend, or anything, as a partner, as a child, I struggled with this as a kid. I used to always think my parents were upset with me, and they would say, Rachel, and that's before I started just going by Ray, but Rachel, get down here, for some reason. And I'd think, I did something. And the first thing I would say to them would be, what did I do? Almost like if I could just be overly dramatic about it, no matter what they had to say to me, couldn't be as bad as that, and it would somehow cancel itself out. But I was always worried about losing friends. I was always worried about upsetting my parents. I was always worried about upsetting my brother. It's a very common thing that goes along with neurodiversity, is this constant fear that you've made mistakes with social cues so often that you're not going to be able to be accepted as who you are. So the accusation Sarah went through about her faking led to her feeling of shame, pain, and withdrawal. And the impact? It delayed her diagnosis. She got less support. That lowered her self-esteem further. She went through more suffering, more trauma, more isolation. I think that we need to learn to shift our focus, and we need to start seeing all of these various overlapping Venn diagram disorders. Instead of being problems to be fixed, we need to really see it more as different ways of experiencing the world. I'm not saying we shouldn't give help in terms of accommodations, but they should be seen as a better way of exploring the world, kind of thing. It's something that they're able to use to their benefit. It's not about a disability per se. People with APD have strengths, they have challenges, they can have lots of creativity and problem-solving skills, they face huge challenges, but the challenges, they don't define them. People with APD are people outside of APD as well. It isn't their one label. I think we've had enough of the medical model when it comes to how it treats various learning and sensory disorders. I think we need to start shifting the focus to see it more as different ways of experiencing the world. And that doesn't mean we can't offer accommodations to make things easier. It doesn't mean we can't have sensory aids like polarized glasses or these low gain hearing aids, et cetera, et cetera. But the focus should be less on fixing the problem as much as making life functionally livable. We really need to work on giving simulations to more people so they have a chance to have the experience, at least sort of going through a situation where it's harder to hear, it's harder to see. The only problem with these simulations is these are people who are typically neurotypical, and they've already defined in their brain what is, like, they have all of the connections already there, so they can fill in the blanks in ways that are not going to be the same as for a person with a disability. So it won't be quite the same experience, but hopefully we can make them struggle enough that it's worthwhile. We should be supporting each other too. There's a lot of people within the auditory processing community that think differently, that might support the Buffalo model, that might support one of the various computerized programming or computerized auditory training type software. And some of us that are doing the low gain hearing aids, we need to be more supportive of each other. We need to talk more about how auditory processing disorder has overlap with ADHD, with dyslexia, with autism, probably with OCD and Tourette's, because we shouldn't be looking at this as just labels stuck on a person. We should be thinking of this as a whole person, and these are the ways that they may be different in the way they perceive the world. I think overall what we need to start looking at is a more holistic, a more real way of considering functional ability and disability and giving people what they perceive will help them as opposed to what is prescribed. We need to be more individualized in general to get this right.